Grace Leland sat quietly in row 14C, her fingers folded neatly in her lap, watching the passengers around her like a hawk observing prey. The hum of the airplane engines was a constant, almost hypnotic drone, but to Grace, it was more than background noise. It was a rhythm, a pulse she could feel in her bones. She had been on hundreds of flights, but today was different. There was a gnawing unease that crawled up her spine, an invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders that she couldn't shake. Across the aisle, a young mother struggled to calm her screaming toddler, bouncing him gently on her knee while muttering soft, rhythmic phrases. Grace's eyes softened. She could see the fear in the child's wide, bright eyes. A man too rose ahead of her, tapped nervously on his phone, his jaw tight, his knuckles white. Everyone was caught in the ordinary dance of air travel, unaware that the ordinary would be shattered in mere minutes. Grace's own thoughts drifted involuntarily to the past. She had been a prodigy in air traffic control, moving quickly through the ranks in her early 20s. By 27, she had been managing some of the busiest flight corridors in the country. She had guided planes through blizzards, electrical failures, and near collisions, relying on nothing but her wits and a sharp mind. She knew what panic looked like, smelled like, and sounded like. And she knew that panic, if allowed to spread unchecked, could be lethal. She glanced out the window at the soft blanket of clouds stretching endlessly below. The sky was a brilliant cobalt blue, almost serene, masking the chaos that might erupt above it. Her eyes drifted to the cockpit, and instinct prickled at her. Something didn't feel right. She couldn't explain it, but there was a tension in the air, an imperceptible shiver that ran through the fuselage. Grace's hand tightened over the edge of the seat. Suddenly, a violent jolt threw everyone forward. Coffee spilled, papers scattered like frightened birds, and the baby's cries rose to a piercing crescendo. The passengers gasped, gripping armrests, clinging to whatever stability they could find. Grace's eyes snapped to the cockpit door. A flicker of movement, something that wasn't right. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," the flight attendant's voice trembled. We're experiencing some turbulence." Her words were calm, but her tone betrayed the truth. This wasn't ordinary turbulence. Grace's mind raced. She reached for the small notebook in her bag, a notebook she carried on every flight, filled with flight routes, emergency procedures, and notes from decades of training. Her hands shook slightly as she opened it to a page she had marked years ago, Pilot Incapacitation Protocol. She hadn't expected to ever need it, certainly not on a commercial flight. A sudden guttural cough echoed from the cockpit. Grace's stomach dropped. That sound was wrong. It wasn't a normal cough. It was shallow, desperate, almost imperceptible. She leaned forward, straining to see past the cockpit door. The flight attendant noticed her movement and gave a questioning glance. Grace shook her head slightly, refusing to reveal her growing anxiety. Another jolt hit. This one was harsher, violent enough to send a laptop tumbling down the aisle. People screamed, and Grace felt a surge of adrenaline ignite in her veins. Her training kicked in automatically. Assess, observe, react. The air around her was thick with tension, hearts pounding in sync with the rattling fuselage. Then the whisper came from the flight attendant. It was barely audible over the roar of the engines. "Both pilots, they're down." Grace froze. Her mind struggled to comprehend the words. Both pilots down? No, that couldn't be possible. And yet, instinct screamed at her that it was true. She didn't need to see them to know they were unconscious. The sickening sensation of responsibility pressed down on her chest like a physical weight. Her gaze shifted to the terrified passengers. Faces pale, eyes wide, lips pressed into thin lines. The panic was beginning to ripple outward, subtle at first, like the first wave of a tsunami. Grace knew she had to act. If she didn't, 164 lives could be at stake. She took a deep breath, the kind her instructors had taught her when guiding planes through emergencies. Slow, controlled. She rose from her seat, moving with a calm precision that belied the fear clawing at her chest. Every eye in the cabin turned toward her. She didn't address them. There was no time for speeches. Her focus was on the cockpit, on the lives she had been trained to protect, on the responsibility she had never asked for but could not ignore. The cabin crew parted instinctively as she approached the cockpit door. Her hand hovered over the handle, hesitation striking for the briefest moment. What she was about to do was unprecedented. There was no protocol for this, no precedent, no guidebook. And yet, she couldn't turn back. She had been trained to navigate chaos, to confront emergencies head-on. Her fingers gripped the door handle. The metal was cold, biting against her skin. She pushed it open slowly, half expecting the pilots to spring to life to reassure her that everything was fine. But the sight that met her eyes stole her breath. Captain Reyes slumped against the throttle, eyes closed, a thin sheen of sweat across his forehead. First Officer Dalton leaned against the instrument panel, barely breathing. Her stomach lurched. Grace's heart pounded in her ears. She scanned the cockpit, memorizing the layout in seconds, nodding the yoke, the throttle, the switches, the warning lights flashing red like miniature emergency sirens. She recognized each alarm, each signal, each flashing indicator. But recognition wasn't enough. She had to act. "Call ATC," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath it. "Now." The flight attendant fumbled with the intercom, panic threading through her hands. Static erupted. Grace could barely hear the control tower over the interference. The plane jolted violently again, and Grace had to brace herself against the captain's chair to avoid being thrown forward. A glance back at the passengers froze her momentarily. Fear had etched itself into every face, from the wide-eyed teenager gripping his sister's hand to the elderly man clutching the armrest until his knuckles turned white. The weight of responsibility bore down on Grace. She couldn't fail. Not now, not ever. "Okay," she muttered to herself. "Let's do this." She pulled the throttles toward herself gently, testing the resistance. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline, despite the fear. She had never flown a commercial aircraft, but the principles she knew, the instincts honed over years, were guiding her every movement. A deep mechanical groan resonated through the fuselage. The plane lurched again. Grace's stomach dropped. This was no longer theory. This was real. Every second mattered. One wrong move and they could all be lost. The flight attendant whispered from behind her, "Do you really think you can?" Grace didn't turn. "I have to," she said simply. It wasn't a question. Outside the cockpit window, clouds swirled like a storm waiting to strike. The horizon was obscured, the sun a pale smear behind thick vapor. Grace felt the full scope of the challenge before her. A commercial airliner, 30,000 feet in the air, fully loaded and no trained pilots at the helm. She placed her hands firmly on the yoke. Her training, her instincts, her years of experience guiding planes through impossible scenarios all converged in this one moment. The hum of the engines, the subtle vibration of the wings, the faint shift of air pressure, it all spoke to her. She had to listen. She had to trust it. Grace exhaled slowly, centering herself. She glanced back at the cabin one last time. Faces turned toward her, a mixture of hope, fear, and disbelief etched into every expression. Her eyes met those of a young girl clutching a stuffed animal, wide and frightened. Grace offered a small nod, reassuring, determined. "This is going to be okay," she whispered to herself. "We're going to get through this." And with that, she turned back to the cockpit controls. The door closed behind her with a quiet click, sealing her fate and theirs. At that moment, 30,000 feet above the ground, Grace Leland became more than a passenger. She became the only chance of survival for 164 souls. Grace Leland's hands hovered over the controls, her mind racing faster than the engines thrumming beneath her. The cockpit smelled of recycled air, antiseptic, and something metallic, maybe the faint scent of blood from the pilots. She swallowed hard. Both Captain Reyes and First Officer Dalton were completely unresponsive, slumped unnaturally against the seats. Their breaths were shallow, almost imperceptible. Every instinct in Grace screamed that she was alone. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing against her chest, heavier than any plane she had ever tracked from the tower. She had seen emergencies before, but never like this. Never with this kind of responsibility resting entirely on her shoulders. One miscalculation, one delayed decision, and all 164 lives aboard Flight 282 could be lost. The first step was clear: stabilize the plane. But as she reached for the throttle, the aircraft lurched violently to the left. Grace's stomach lurched with it, and a scream tore through the cabin behind her. The plane pitched again, the wings tilting at a dangerous angle. She braced herself against the yoke, knuckles whitening, and tried to fight the natural instinct to panic. "Okay, think," she whispered to herself. Her mind flashed back to her time as an air traffic controller, guiding pilots through storms, mechanical failures, and emergencies she had only imagined in simulations. She had never flown a plane, but she knew the principles. She had memorized every maneuver, every contingency, every emergency procedure. Now it was time to apply them, not theoretically, not as an observer, but in the flesh, in the air, in real life, with real people's lives hanging by a thread. The first officer coughed weakly, a sound so faint it could have been mistaken for air turbulence. Grace leaned closer, feeling the panic spike through her veins. No, she couldn't rely on anyone else. Not now. Not ever. Her eyes darted to the instruments, the myriad of buttons, lights, and levers blinking frantically, as if the plane itself were screaming for help. "Call ATC," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the adrenaline threatening to overwhelm her. "I need the tower. Get me on the line." The flight attendant, pale and trembling, fumbled with the radio. Her fingers shook as she held the microphone, and static erupted across the speaker. The intercom screeched and hissed, a white noise that threatened to drown out everything else. Grace's teeth clenched, her mind running through every procedure she had memorized, every protocol she had ever drilled. She repeated her request, louder this time. "Air traffic control, Flight 282, pilots are incapacitated. I am a former air traffic controller. I need guidance." Static answered her. The plane lurched again, the sound of metal groaning under stress echoing through the cabin. Passengers screamed, their fear cascading into a wave that pressed against Grace's resolve. She could feel their panic, their confusion, their terror, and she knew that if she didn't take command now, chaos would overwhelm them all. Grace forced herself to breathe, slowly, deliberately. She scanned the cockpit, noting the positions of the yoke, throttle, and stabilizer. Her hands trembled as she gripped the controls. The plane rocked, pitching dangerously. She adjusted the throttle slightly, feeling the slight pushback, the resistance of machinery that wasn't meant to be guided by someone untrained in flight. But she had no choice. The first officer stirred again, a weak cough. Grace reached out instinctively, checking for pulse, for response. Nothing. His face was pale and his eyes fluttered briefly before closing again. Captain Reyes remained slumped over the console, the rise and fall of his chest barely perceptible. Time was bleeding away, each second a hammer threatening to crush her. A jolt threw her forward and she braced against the yoke. The engine on the right sputtered, coughing violently. Red warning lights flashed across the panel, an ominous, urgent chorus that screamed in the deafening roar of the engines. Grace's hands moved automatically, guided by muscle memory and sheer determination. She adjusted the throttle, monitored the instruments, and tried to keep the plane level. Her mind raced. Flaps, stabilizer, gear, altitude. What do I prioritize? Her memories of her years guiding pilots flashed through her mind, but this was different. This wasn't a radio call or a simulation. This was 30,000 feet in the air, with lives depending entirely on her decisions. The cabin erupted behind her. Passengers screamed, a cacophony of panic and fear. Grace could hear the toddler crying, a sharp, piercing sound that tore at her heart. She pressed her lips together, trying to project calmness, trying to breathe steadiness into the cabin. "We're going to be okay," she whispered, almost to herself. She knew she had to believe it. They had to believe it. Then a warning light flashed red on the console. Stabilizer failure. Grace's stomach dropped. The plane tilted dangerously, and her hands moved instinctively to counter the roll. She fought the yoke with every ounce of strength she had. The metal groaned under the strain, the fuselage shuddering like a living thing in pain. She glanced out the cockpit window. Clouds rushed past like a blurring canvas, the sun slicing through the gaps, throwing fleeting patterns of light and shadow across the cockpit. She realized the truth. They were not just fighting turbulence. The plane was in critical distress, and every movement had to be precise, deliberate, and courageous. A voice crackled over the intercom, barely audible through static. Grace recognized the voice instantly, a familiar tone she hadn't expected to hear. "Grace Leland, is that you?" Her pulse raced. Recognition, history, connection, all at once. Grace didn't have time to respond. She focused on stabilizing the plane, adjusting the throttles, and monitoring the instruments. The voice repeated, louder this time, breaking through the white noise. "You need help. Military support is inbound. Hold tight." Grace exhaled a shaky breath. Relief washed over her briefly before she realized the full scope of the challenge. Help was coming, but not fast enough. The plane was still lurching, the stabilizer warning flashing, the engines coughing and sputtering. Every second mattered. Every choice could mean life or death. She glanced back at the passengers again. Faces pale, wide-eyed, frozen in terror. The elderly man gripping his armrest, the young woman clutching her child, the teenager holding his sister tightly. She had to project calmness even if she didn't feel it. Their survival depended on her composure. Grace's hands moved with a mixture of training, instinct, and sheer determination. She monitored the throttles, checked the stabilizers, and tried to keep the plane level. Every motion was calculated, deliberate, yet tense with the knowledge that any error could be catastrophic. Then another jolt, violent, sudden, throwing her against the yoke. The engine sputtered again. Warning lights flashed across the console. Grace's mind went into overdrive, analyzing, calculating, responding. She adjusted the throttle, countered the tilt, and focused on one thing: keep the plane in the air. Time stretched, seconds elongated into eternity. Grace felt a bead of sweat run down her temple. She ignored it. She couldn't afford distraction. 164 lives were counting on her. She had never flown a commercial plane, yet here she was, acting like she had done it all her life. She realized something fundamental. She had been preparing for this moment her entire career, long before she even understood it. A violent shudder ran through the plane. Grace's hands gripped the yoke tighter, her knuckles white. The plane pitched dangerously, and the stabilizer warning continued to flash. But she didn't falter. She had to act. She had to survive. She had to keep everyone alive. Then through the static, a new sound reached her ears, the unmistakable roar of fighter jets approaching. Grace turned her head, squinting through the cockpit window. 2 F-35s slid into formation on either side of the aircraft, sleek and formidable. The sight sent a shiver of relief through her spine. A voice crackled over the radio, calm, precise, military. "Grace Leland, we've got you. We're here. Follow our guidance. You'll make it." Grace's hands tightened on the yoke. She nodded, even though they couldn't see her. Relief and fear intertwined, but she allowed herself a fraction of hope. The battle wasn't over, but she wasn't alone anymore. The cockpit was still chaos. The stabilizer groaned, the engines faltered, the plane rocked. But Grace Leland, former air traffic controller, unlikely hero, now held the fate of 164 people in her hands, and she had no choice but to rise to it. She swallowed hard, bracing herself for the impossible. The survival of every single person on Flight 282 rested entirely on her next move. Grace Leland's pulse was a hammer in her chest as she clutched the yoke, every nerve on fire. The F-35s flanking Flight 282 gleamed like shadows against the shifting clouds outside the cockpit windows, their wings slicing through the air with deadly precision. For a fraction of a second, Grace felt a strange sense of reassurance. Military-grade precision was watching over her. She could survive this, maybe. But that fraction of hope was ripped away as turbulence struck like a physical blow. The plane lurched violently to the left, and the cabin erupted in a chorus of terror. Coffee mugs flew, overhead bins rattled open, and a child's terrified scream pierced the chaos. Grace's stomach pitched. Her hands fought the yoke, adjusting instinctively to counter the sudden roll. The plane's wings groaned under the stress. Every metal joint in the fuselage screamed protest. "Keep her steady," she muttered to herself. Her voice trembled despite her effort to remain calm. The stabilizer warning continued to flash, red and relentless, and Grace's mind calculated that each adjustment might not hold for more than a few seconds. One misstep, one delayed reaction, and the aircraft could spiral out of control. Through the chaos, a voice crackled over the radio. Clear, precise, calm, unbelievably calm. "Flight 282, this is Falcon Lead. We have visual, you are not alone." Grace froze, her heart skipped. That voice, familiar, a name she hadn't expected to hear in decades, echoing from a world she had left behind. Falcon Lead. She recognized him instantly, a pilot she had guided through a deadly storm in Kandahar years ago. At the time, she had been an air traffic controller coordinating a medevac mission. The memory surged like electricity through her body. He had survived because of her guidance. And now, here he was, in the sky beside her, a lifeline for all aboard Flight 282. Her hands tightened on the yoke. "Falcon Lead, I don't have control. My pilots are down," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I've never flown a commercial aircraft." There was a pause, and then Falcon Lead's voice returned, sharp and commanding. "Grace, we know, we see you. You can do this. I'll guide you through every maneuver. Listen carefully. Stay calm." The reassurance was like a lifeline in a storm-tossed sea. But even as relief brushed her, the plane shuddered violently again. Grace's stomach dropped, and a cold wave of fear swept over her. The stabilizer groaned. Something in the tail section screeched under pressure. Metal strained. The aircraft tilted sharply, almost tipping beyond control. Her breath caught. She could see the faint horizon through the cloud layer, but it was distorted, shifting. Visibility was poor. The instruments were her only reliable guide, yet even they were flashing warnings she barely understood. The plane felt alive, as though it were resisting her every move, testing her, mocking her audacity. "Focus, Grace," she whispered. "Just one move at a time." She adjusted the throttle, nudging the yoke to counter the tilt. Her movements were precise, calculated, guided by memory and instinct. Every small adjustment mattered. Every second counted. Below her, the clouds churned like a boiling cauldron, a violent gray sea concealing the world beneath. She knew that even if she stabilized the plane for now, the real challenge, landing, was still ahead. The cabin was a tempest of fear. Passengers were crying, gripping seats and each other, eyes wide, bodies trembling. Grace could hear whispered prayers, the sobs of children, and the silent panic of adults holding themselves together. She knew she had to project calmness, to be the eye of the storm. One wrong word could ignite chaos. Her gaze flicked to the first officer and captain again. Their breathing was shallow, fragile. The thought that their lives were slipping away mingled with the fear for the passengers. She had to act now decisively. Falcon Lead's voice cut through the din. "You're fighting the wrong way. I can see your angle adjust now. Flaps down slowly. Throttle at 40%, trust me." Grace's fingers flew over the controls, adjusting each lever and button as instructed. The plane shuddered violently again, a sickening groan echoing through the fuselage. Sparks flew from a panel near the throttle. The plane was deteriorating under the stress, every mechanical system screaming. Grace's teeth clenched as she fought to keep it in the air. She glanced again at the cabin. A teenager had his arm around his little sister, trying to comfort her as her cries tore through the cabin. A mother was clutching her baby so tightly her knuckles were white. The elderly man in the aisle had his eyes squeezed shut, his lips moving in silent prayer. Grace's chest ached with the weight of responsibility. Every life on this plane was a heartbeat in her hands, fragile and fleeting. Then another violent shake, stronger, more insistent, made the yoke jerk in her grasp. The plane tilted dangerously, the wings groaning under the strain. Grace's stomach lurched, and she barely caught herself from sliding forward. Her hands moved with precision, guided by instinct and raw courage as she pushed, pulled, and twisted the controls to counter the roll. "Almost there," she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. "Just a little more, keep her steady." A new warning light flashed red. Engine malfunction right. The plane's right engine sputtered violently, coughing smoke into the turbine. Panic surged through her veins. One engine down could be catastrophic at this altitude, but she didn't have time to dwell. Falcon Lead's voice returned, calm but insistent. "Grace, you're holding it. Don't panic. Follow my lead. I'll guide you to a manageable descent. Stay focused." She exhaled slowly, forcing herself to calm her racing heart. She had done impossible things before, though never like this. The commercial airliner was a beast, unfamiliar, uncooperative, yet she understood its language enough to coax it into compliance. Her hands moved automatically, adjusting stabilizers, throttles, and rudder controls, each motion deliberate, each adjustment crucial. Suddenly, a massive jolt rocked the plane, throwing her against the yoke. She gritted her teeth, bracing against the impact. The fuselage groaned ominously, metal straining. Grace could hear the faint cracking of the tail section under stress. Her stomach churned. This was no ordinary turbulence. This was a battle between human will and mechanical chaos, and she was at the center. Falcon Lead's voice cut sharply. "Grace, left trim, now stabilize the wings." Grace's hands flew to the trim wheel, twisting and adjusting with desperate precision. The plane responded, albeit slowly, trembling under the strain. Sweat ran down her forehead. Sparks from the console illuminated the cockpit in sharp, white bursts. Each second was a test of nerve, endurance, and skill. The F-35s outside moved with uncanny precision, guiding her, shielding her from wind shear and erratic air currents. They were guardians in steel suits, angels of the sky, their presence giving her just enough courage to keep fighting. She glanced to her left. The pilot in the F-35 nodded subtly, confirming her adjustments. Grace took a deep breath. Her hands were raw, muscles trembling. She felt the plane's weight, its hunger, its fragility. She was not just flying, she was wrestling life from death, balancing terror with determination. One wrong movement could kill everyone on board. She looked back at the passengers. Faces frozen in terror, hands clasped together, prayers whispered into the thin air. She had no choice. Every ounce of focus, every scrap of skill, every memory of guiding pilots through impossible situations had led her here. She could not fail. And then the clouds ahead began to clear, a faint glimmer of sunlight cutting through the gray. Falcon Lead's voice was calm, steady, like a lifeline in the storm. "You're lined up, just a little more. You've got this, trust yourself." Grace exhaled, letting the tiniest fraction of hope seep in. The plane shuddered one last time, the stabilizer groaning, engines coughing, yet holding. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the strange, electric thrill of survival against impossible odds. But even as hope flickered, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Below lay the Earth, obscured by clouds. Flight 282 had survived the storm, but landing it, intact, controlled, without her pilots, was a challenge unlike any she had ever faced. The plane leveled slightly, its wings trembling under the stress. Grace's jaw set. Her fingers gripped the yoke tighter. She could do this. She had no choice but to do this. Because at 30,000 feet, above a swirling, violent sky, Grace Leland wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for 164 lives, and failure was not an option. And somewhere in the distance, the F-35s waited, ready to guide her through the impossible next step, the descent. Grace Leland's hands shook slightly, her knuckles white, as the commercial jet continued to groan under the strain of her control. The stabilizer warning still flashed relentlessly, a cruel reminder that the aircraft was hanging on by a thread. Every jolt made her stomach lurch. Every screech of metal sounded like the plane crying out for help. The cabin behind her was a chorus of panic and terror. The cries of children, the sobs of adults, the terrified prayers whispered into the thin air, all amplifying the tension that already clawed at her nerves. Her gaze returned to the F-35s outside. They were still flanking Flight 282, sleek and deadly, like twin shadows in the turbulent sky. Grace could see the faint glint of sunlight reflecting off their wings, and somehow their presence gave her a flicker of hope, proof that she was not entirely alone in this impossible fight. But even hope could not mask the raw reality. The plane was failing. Every second she felt the metal beneath her shiver, strain, protest. Then over the radio, a new voice cut through the chaos. A calm, authoritative, almost impossibly composed voice. Flight 282, this is Falcon Lead. Grace, listen carefully. We're going to get you through this. Focus on my instructions one at a time. We've got visual. You are not alone. Grace's heart hammered, a mixture of relief and adrenaline surging through her veins. Recognition, history, that name. Falcon Lead had been someone she had guided through a deadly storm in Kandahar years ago. Then she had saved his life from the chaos of the battlefield. Now he was here, returning the favor. Her lips moved, almost involuntarily. "Falcon Lead, you're real," she whispered, a shaky tremor in her voice. "I don't know if I can." "Yes, you can. You've already held it together this long," Falcon Lead interrupted, sharp but reassuring. "Listen to me. Follow my lead. Step 1, manual trim override. It's under the captain's left. Do not hesitate, move now." Grace's eyes darted to the indicated spot. Her hand moved, trembling as it found the wheel. She twisted, adjusting the trim. The plane groaned in protest, shuddering violently, but the movement had an effect, subtle yet undeniable. Slowly, ever so slowly, the plane began to respond. Her chest tightened. One correct adjustment, one deliberate action, and she was moving toward stabilizing the beast under her control. "Good," Falcon Lead's voice continued. "Now keep her level. I'll guide you on throttle adjustments. Don't overcorrect. Trust yourself. You've got this." Grace took a deep, deliberate breath. The plane pitched again, the right engine coughing violently, sparks flying from the panel near the throttle. She pressed her lips together, forcing herself to focus. Every instrument, every light, every trembling piece of metal was communicating with her, guiding her if she would only listen. She adjusted the throttle slowly, her fingers trembling, eyes flicking between the instruments and the F-35 outside. The wingtip of Falcon Lead's jet dipped slightly, a signal, subtle, precise. Grace mirrored the movement, coaxing the commercial jet into compliance. Her heart raced, her chest felt tight, but her hand stayed steady. One wrong move now, and it would be catastrophic. The cabin shuddered again. Passengers screamed. Grace could hear the terrified prayers of mothers, the frantic whispers of children, the sharp inhalations of fear from every corner. She knew she had to project calmness. Her voice, when she spoke, needed to carry authority. "It's going to be okay," she said, almost a whisper directed at the cabin. "We're going to make it." A young girl clutched a stuffed animal, her wide eyes locked on Grace. The girl's trembling hands mirrored the fear of everyone else. Grace forced a small nod in their direction, though she did not let her own fear show. This was a performance as much as it was survival. The passengers needed to trust her even if she was fighting for her own survival. Another violent shake hit. Sparks flew from the electrical panel. Grace's hands tightened on the yoke. The stabilizer groaned, the fuselage shuddered, and she felt the plane tilt dangerously. Her stomach lurched. She had seconds to react, and the weight of responsibility pressed down harder than ever. "Manual override now. Left trim full rotation," Falcon Lead shouted over the comms. Grace's fingers found the trim wheel. She twisted with all her strength. The plane groaned, pitching violently. Her arms ached, her wrists screamed, but the yoke remained within her control. Slowly, ever so slowly, the wings leveled. A sigh of relief escaped her lips, but she couldn't allow herself to relax. Not yet. The stabilizer warning flashed red. The engine sputtered. Every system on the aircraft was strained to its limits. She glanced back at the cockpit crew. Captain Reyes and First Officer Dalton remained slumped, unconscious. The realization struck her hard. She was truly alone in this. She was the only person who could save them. The F-35s outside moved in perfect formation, guiding her through turbulence, their presence almost tangible, a steady rhythm in the chaos. Falcon Lead's voice remained her tether to sanity, directing throttle adjustments, wing tilts, and rudder corrections. She mirrored every subtle movement, trusting instinct, training, and the guidance of someone she had once saved. Grace exhaled slowly, forcing herself to focus on each instruction. One step at a time, the trim wheel, the throttle, the yoke, every adjustment precise, every second critical. The plane shuddered again, threatening to roll, but she countered expertly. Her heart pounded, her muscles screamed, yet she stayed in command. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice a change. Their fear hadn't vanished, but there was now a subtle shift, a sense that someone was controlling the chaos. Grace caught the eye of a mother holding a baby. Their gaze locked for a brief moment. The mother's tears reflected hope. Grace nodded slightly, silently telling them, "We can survive this." Another jolt hit, stronger than the previous ones. The fuselage groaned, metal screeching under strain. Sparks from the panel flashed brightly. Grace's hands tightened. This was the critical moment, the turning point. If she failed now, they all would die. If she succeeded, she would have begun the impossible rescue. Throttle 50%. Stabilize wings, keep her level. "You're doing fine," Falcon Lead instructed. Grace adjusted the throttles, her muscles screaming from exertion. She twisted the trim wheel. Slowly, the plane responded. Not perfectly, not without resistance, but enough. Enough to stabilize, enough to fight for survival. And then over the radio, another voice crackled, hesitant, almost in awe. "Flight 282, that's incredible. We're watching." Grace swallowed hard. She allowed herself the briefest spark of hope. Someone was witnessing her fight. She was not invisible, she was not powerless. And yet the challenge was far from over. The plane shuddered violently once more, a deep groan echoing through the fuselage. The cabin lurched, passengers gripping their seats as though their lives depended on it, because they did. Grace's arms ached, her knuckles white, but her hands remained steady on the yoke. The plane was responding, slowly, fragilely, but responding. Falcon Lead's voice came again, calm and commanding. "You're doing it, Grace. Hold her steady, prepare for descent. I'll guide you to a manageable altitude. We've got this." Grace exhaled slowly. The plane was stabilizing. She had regained control. The engines were faltering but holding. The wings leveled. The F-35s flanking her like guardian angels gave her guidance, shielding her from unpredictable air currents. She glanced back at the cabin, faces pale, eyes wide but alive. She had bought them time. She had held them in the air. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the raw, electric thrill of survival, not victory yet, but the taste of it, a glimmer of hope amidst terror. Grace's lips moved, almost inaudibly. "We're not done yet, but we're alive." The plane, still trembling, held steady under her hands. The stabilizer light blinked less urgently. The engines were coughing but functional. Flight 282 was still in the air. And somewhere through the static, Falcon Lead's voice reminded her, "Brace yourself. The hardest part is coming, landing, but you can do it. We'll get you there." Grace's chest tightened. She exhaled slowly, bracing herself. She had survived the first storm, but the sky was still violent, the plane fragile, and the next challenge would demand every ounce of courage, skill, and instinct she possessed. At 30,000 feet, Grace Leland had become the single point of survival for 164 souls. and the sky was about to test her again. The cabin was a symphony of terror. Every heartbeat, every gulp of breath, every shiver of panic amplified the stakes. Grace Leland's mind raced faster than the engines humming beneath her. She had stabilized the aircraft, but she knew that was only the first victory. Now, she had to navigate 164 lives toward a landing they might not survive. She glanced through the cockpit window. The F-35s remained in formation, twin guardians of steel, their wings slicing through turbulent skis like knives. Falcon leads calm, commanding voice continued to guide her over the radio, cutting through static and fear. Throttle adjustment steady. Keep wings level. We're lining you up for a safe descent. You're doing great. Don't let the fear control you. Grace exhaled slowly, her fingers trembling over the yoke. Safe descent. Those words felt impossible. The plane groaned under its own weight. Sparks flickered from the panels like warning lights from the heavens. She felt every vibration, every groan of metal, every quiver of the wings. She turned her gaze toward the cabin. The passengers were frozen in fear, their eyes wide, some staring blankly at the overhead bins, others clutching hands or loved ones. She noticed a teenager holding his little sister tightly, both of them trembling. A mother held a baby to her chest as though it were the only thing keeping her alive. The elderly man too rose ahead, arms clasped over his chest, lips moving in silent prayer. Grace's heart tightened. She could not fail, not for them, not for the pilots slumped beside her, not for the strangers depending on her every decision. She had trained for emergencies before, guided pilots through life-or-death scenarios from the safety of a control tower, but this was different. This was real, and every motion she made carried consequences she could not undo. The plane shuddered again. Sparks flickered from the electrical panel near the throttles. The stabilizer warning flashed red, a relentless reminder of the aircraft's fragile state. Grace's fingers flew across the controls, adjusting the yoke, twisting the trim wheel, nudging the throttles. Every move deliberate, every adjustment a delicate negotiation with a machine far beyond her usual domain. Falcon Lead's voice cut sharply through the static. Grace listened carefully. Left wing slight adjustment 5 degrees, right throttle to 40%. Steady, steady. Her hands followed his instructions with precise instinct. The plane responded, trembling, yes, but slowly, almost reluctantly, aligning with the invisible path he guided her toward. The turbulence intensified. The aircraft pitched violently, nearly tossing Grace against the overhead panel. The cabin erupted in terrified cries, the sound amplified by the fuselage shaking around them. She glanced at the first officer, still unconscious, still a lifeless weight on the panel. She knew she was alone in this, completely. She swallowed hard and spoke firmly to the cabin, her voice carrying authority even as her own fear threatened to break through. "We're going to make it. Stay calm, trust me. We're going to land safely." Some passengers turned toward her, eyes wide. She could see the tiniest spark of hope flickering in their gaze. She nodded slightly, a silent promise, "We will survive this." Suddenly the aircraft lurched violently. The right engine coughed, sputtering, sending sparks across the panel. Red lights flashed relentlessly. Grace's stomach dropped. She forced herself to remain calm, guiding the plane with slow, deliberate motions. She knew instinctively that panicking would doom them all. She glanced toward the F-35s. They were unwavering, perfectly synchronized, cutting through the turbulence with surgical precision. Falcon Lead's wing dipped slightly, a signal, a visual cue. Grace adjusted, the plane responding just enough to hold it steady. Time seemed to stretch. Every second dragged, each moment a test of endurance. She felt the weight of 164 lives on her shoulders, every heartbeat a drumbeat of urgency in her mind. The cabin's fear was contagious, but she had to remain the anchor. One wrong word, one misstep, could ignite chaos and make the plane uncontrollable. Another jolt shook the fuselage. The stabilizer groaned. Sparks leapt from the panel like tiny shooting stars of warning. Grace gritted her teeth. Her muscles ached from the strain. Every motion was agony, but she refused to release her grip on the yoke. She reached for the emergency checklist taped to the console. Her fingers traced the steps instinctively: throttle adjustments, rudder alignment, flaps, stabilizer trim. She ran through each step mechanically, yet fully conscious of the stakes. Her hands moved with precision, guided by experience and sheer adrenaline. Then, over the radio, Falcon Lead's voice rang with calm authority. "You're lined up for the riverbank emergency strip. Visibility low, but you can do it. Flaps down, slow descent. You're steady. Trust your instincts." Grace's stomach tightened. The emergency strip. Narrow. Unforgiving. She felt the weight of the challenge pressing down on her, the enormity of controlling a commercial jet with 2 incapacitated pilots and hundreds of lives at stake. She focused on the instruments, the faint glimmer of the river below and the guiding F-35s beside her. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the flaps. The plane shuddered under the strain. The wings groaned, metal protesting every movement. She adjusted the throttles, easing the descent. Sparks flickered from the panel again, a visual reminder that the plane was teetering on the edge of mechanical failure. The passengers were crying now, voices muffled through sobs and panic. Grace could hear the young girl clutching her stuffed animal, the baby's soft whimpers, the elderly man's whispered prayers. Every soul in the cabin depended on her. She could not falter. She could not fail. Another violent lurch threw her against the yoke. The right engine sputtered again, warning lights flashing. Grace adjusted instinctively, twisting the trim wheel, nudging the rudder, coaxing the plane back into alignment. The F-35s remained at her side, guiding her, steadying her through the turbulence, protecting her from the erratic currents of the storm-tossed sky. Falcon Lead's voice cut sharply. "Brace yourself, Grace. Flare on my signal. Timing is critical. 164 hearts are counting on you. One shot, don't miss it." Her heart pounded, her arms trembling from the strain. She exhaled slowly, focusing all her energy on the instruments, the wings, the throttles. The emergency strip below was narrow, a thin line of asphalt cutting through the terrain. Clouds obscured part of it, the riverbank glinting faintly in the sunlight. "Flare, flare now," Falcon Lead shouted. Grace pulled back hard on the yoke. The plane lurched violently, wheels scraping the runway with sparks flying. The fuselage trembled. She fought the natural urge to panic, controlling the plane with all her strength. The stabilizer protested, the wings groaning, but Flight 282 remained airborne, responding to her command. The plane touched down fully, sliding dangerously along the asphalt. The left landing gear sparked, the nose wheel skidding. She held it steady, adjusting throttle and yoke, coaxing the jet to obey her. Sparks flew from friction, passengers screamed, but slowly, agonizingly, the plane began to slow. Grace exhaled, her entire body trembling with exhaustion. 164 lives had survived the descent. She had fought against chaos, mechanical failure, and fear itself, and for a moment, sheer relief washed over her. The plane finally stopped. Silence, almost incomprehensible, filled the cabin. Passengers stared in shock, disbelief, relief. Some collapsed into the arms of their loved ones. Others sobbed, clutching hands and seats as the enormity of what had just happened sank in. Grace leaned back, her knuckles raw, her muscles screaming, her chest heaving. She had done the impossible. She had held Flight 282 together, brought it safely to the ground, and survived the impossible. And yet through the radio, Falcon Lead's voice reminded her. "This isn't the end, Grace. Stay focused. We'll get everyone out safely. But you just saved 164 lives. Never forget that." Grace exhaled slowly, letting herself feel the weight of what she had done. She had not just landed a plane. She had wrestled life from death, navigated terror and mechanical failure, and guided every soul aboard toward survival. Her eyes swept the cabin one last time, faces pale, teary, trembling, but alive. She had bought them all a second chance. 164 heartbeats, each one a testament to her courage, her instinct, her unwavering resolve. Grace Leland, former air traffic controller, now legendary in her own right, realized this was only the beginning. The true recognition, the acknowledgement of what she had accomplished, was yet to come. And somewhere outside, waiting on the tarmac, were the F-35 pilots who had witnessed her bravery firsthand. They knew. The world would soon know. The engines hummed unevenly, a mechanical heartbeat laced with warning lights and tremors. Grace Leland's knuckles whitened as she gripped the yoke. Flight 282 was alive beneath her hands, yet fragile, every vibration through the fuselage like a pulse warning of imminent catastrophe. The plane had touched down once, but the descent from the chaos of 30,000 feet was far from over. Outside, the sky remained a battlefield. Thick, rolling clouds masked visibility, making the emergency airstrip barely perceptible. The F-35s flanking her guided her through the turbulence like silent sentinels, but even their presence could not calm the unrelenting fear that gripped her chest. Every passenger, every life aboard, relied entirely on her. Falcon Lead's voice broke through the comms, calm but urgent. "Grace, you're approaching the critical zone. Keep wings level, throttle adjustments minor, no sudden moves. The strip is narrow, timing is everything. 164 lives depend on your next move." Grace's stomach tightened. She had already survived the impossible once, stabilizing the plane at cruising altitude and guiding it through violent turbulence. But the descent, the final stage, was always the deadliest. Pilots trained for years spent decades learning how to handle emergencies on approach. She had hours of tower experience, yes, but nothing that could fully prepare her for this. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. One thought rang clear in her mind: control the fear, control the plane. The aircraft pitched violently as a sudden gust struck. Sparks flickered from the throttles, the stabilizer groaned, and the right engine sputtered. The fuselage trembled like a living creature in pain. Grace's hands reacted automatically, nudging the yoke, adjusting the trim, coaxing the machine into compliance. She could feel every vibration, every strain of metal, every protest of machinery. She glanced back at the cabin. Faces pale, eyes wide with fear, hands gripping loved ones or armrests. Children cried, mothers whispered prayers, the elderly clutched seats as if sheer will alone could hold them alive. Grace's chest tightened at the weight of it all. She could not fail, not now, not after everything. Falcon Lead's voice returned, sharper now, slicing through static and fear. "Prepare for approach, flaps incrementally down, throttle 30%, adjust trim 5 degrees left. You can do this. Focus on the instruments, not the fear." Grace's fingers flew over the controls. The plane responded slowly, shuddering under her touch. Sparks shot from the panel, a stark reminder that the aircraft was straining against every adjustment. She ignored the pain in her arms and the tremor in her hands. Every life aboard depended on precision, on patience, on courage. The airstrip appeared below, a sliver of asphalt cutting through a river valley. Clouds obscured parts of it, but the emergency team on the ground was visible, lights flashing, vehicles ready, eyes scanning. She exhaled, letting the tiniest fraction of relief settle over her. But the relief was fragile. One wrong move and the plane could easily overshoot or lose control entirely. Another gust slammed into the fuselage. The wings rocked violently. Grace's stomach lurched and she gritted her teeth, forcing herself to stay calm. She nudged the yoke, twisted the trim wheel, adjusted throttle. Slowly, the aircraft aligned with the strip. Every motion had to be perfect. Every second mattered. In the cabin, passengers began to whisper prayers, clutching hands or loved ones as the aircraft shuddered. Grace heard the soft whimpers of children and the rapid heartbeats of frightened adults. She knew that if she faltered now, the fear would cascade into chaos, potentially tipping the plane beyond control. Falcon Lead's voice cut again, steady and precise. "You're lined up. Slow descent, keep her steady. Flare at 50 feet. 50 feet, Grace, do not overcorrect." Grace exhaled. She felt the plane's weight, every vibration, every strain, as if it were a living, breathing creature. Her hands moved instinctively. The yoke was her lifeline, the throttles her heartbeat. She was no longer just a former air traffic controller. She was the lifeline of Flight 282. The plane trembled violently. The right engine sputtered, throwing sparks against the panels. Grace forced herself to breathe steadily, focusing on the instruments. She adjusted flaps incrementally, nudged the trim wheel, and coaxed the plane toward the strip. Each second stretched into an eternity, each adjustment a negotiation with death itself. A violent shudder rocked the fuselage, and the nose dipped slightly too far. Grace's stomach lurched. She yanked back on the yoke, stabilizing the plane just in time. The wings groaned, the fuselage trembled, sparks flickering from the electrical panel. Sweat ran down her temples. She gritted her teeth. She could not falter now. The F-35s outside shifted formation slightly, signaling her, guiding her path. Falcon Lead's voice was calm, a tether to sanity in the chaos. "Flare, flare now, 50 feet, you've got this. Steady, steady." Grace pulled back hard on the yoke. The plane lurched, wheels descending toward the emergency strip. The fuselage shuddered violently as metal met asphalt with sparks and screeching. She adjusted throttle and rudder with precise micro-movements, coaxing the plane into alignment. The nose gear touched, bounced slightly, and then the plane began to slide along the strip, trembling under the immense stress. The cabin erupted into terrified gasps, some passengers gripping loved ones, some frozen in disbelief. Grace exhaled slowly, forcing herself to remain in control. Every motion mattered. Every fraction of a second could spell disaster. She guided the plane with painstaking precision. Sparks from friction dotted the asphalt. The wings quivered, stabilizer warnings flickered, the engines coughed, but the aircraft remained intact. Grace forced herself to focus, each adjustment deliberate, each motion calculated. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the plane slowed, gradually coming to a halt. Silence filled the cabin, shocked, trembling, miraculous silence. She exhaled, her body shaking, her arms trembling from exertion. 164 lives had survived. Against impossible odds, Flight 282 had made it. The passengers stared in disbelief, some collapsing into tears of relief, some hugging loved ones tightly. The child clutching a stuffed animal looked up at Grace, wide-eyed, and she offered a reassuring smile. Mothers whispered thanks, elderly passengers nodded with tears streaming. Grace finally allowed herself to breathe, the weight of the impossible task settling heavily on her shoulders. She had done more than land a plane. She had fought chaos, fear, and death itself, and prevailed. Outside, the F-35 pilots gave a subtle salute. Falcon Lead's voice crackled over the radio one last time. "Grace Leland, you've saved them all. 164 heartbeats. Never forget that. You're a legend." Grace exhaled, shoulders sagging. She had wrestled life from death, guiding a commercial airliner through turbulence, engine failure, and panic, and brought it safely to the ground. She realized for the first time fully the magnitude of what she had accomplished. Not just survival, not just bravery, a miracle at 30,000 feet executed by one extraordinary woman. And though the adrenaline still surged, a quiet sense of accomplishment washed over her. She had faced the impossible and survived. Grace Leland, the unlikely hero, had done what no one believed possible. The roar of the engines faded into an almost surreal silence. Flight 282 sat on the tarmac like a wounded giant, metal trembling from the stress it had endured. Grace Leland's hands fell from the yoke, trembling and slick with sweat, her arms shaking with exhaustion she had never known before. The cockpit lights flickered, warning panels still blinking faintly in protest, but the plane was, miraculously, whole. Her chest heaved as she leaned back against the seat, eyes closed for a brief moment. She had done it. Against every ounce of logic, against fear, turbulence, failing engines, and unconscious pilots, she had brought 164 souls safely to the ground. Her body screamed from the strain, but her mind was already shifting. There was no time for celebration yet. Every eye in the cabin was on her, wide with shock, disbelief, and awe. A mother cried openly, clutching her child, whispering thanks between sobs. An elderly man, shaking with relief, reached forward and touched the seatback in front of him, muttering a prayer of gratitude. A young teenager, pale and wide-eyed, whispered to his sister, She saved us." Their words cut straight to Grace's chest. She forced herself to smile, to nod, to offer reassurance, even as the adrenaline still throbbed through her veins. The cabin crew, still trembling, moved to assist passengers with trembling hands. Their faces were a mixture of awe and relief. Grace realized that the simple act of survival, the act of bringing everyone through the impossible, was no longer just an extraordinary feat. It was legendary. Outside, the hum of approaching engines caught her attention. Two sleek F-35s banked elegantly toward the tarmac, descending with the precision of warriors returning home. The jets landed nearby, and pilots emerged, their movements deliberate, almost ceremonial. Grace watched, still trembling as the lead pilot, the same Falcon lead who had guided her through the impossible, approached with purposeful strides. He stopped at the edge of the tarmac, eyes fixed on her through the cockpit window. There was no need for words. The respect, the recognition, the acknowledgement of what she had just accomplished radiated from him like an unspoken vow. Grace felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders, heavier than any plane she had ever controlled. "Grace," Falcon lead said, his voice steady and commanding, carrying across the distance with a weight that made every word feel like history in motion. "You've just done something no one thought possible. Against all odds, you saved 164 lives. You've earned more than our respect. You've earned a place among legends." Grace felt her throat tighten. She wanted to speak, to thank him, to explain that she was just a former air traffic controller doing her job, but words failed her. The enormity of what she had accomplished pressed in from every direction, a tide of emotion she could barely contain. Then a movement caught her eye. The other F-35 pilot, moving with military precision, executed a salute, the crisp, formal gesture of respect. Falcon lead followed, arms raised, fingers straight. A salute not just for survival, not just for courage, but for mastery over chaos itself. Grace blinked, stunned. The recognition of two highly trained fighter pilots, professionals who faced death daily, honoring her bravery. It was almost too much to comprehend. She felt tears sting her eyes, not from exhaustion, but from the pure, overwhelming weight of being seen, of being recognized, of having her heroism validated in a way that transcended words. "Call sign," Falcon lead asked, his gaze steady. Grace hesitated. Call signs were not given lightly. They were earned. They were badges of honor, symbols of skill, courage, and legacy. She had never considered herself worthy. She was simply Grace, former controller, passenger in control, the unlikely hero. But Falcon lead's eyes held no doubt. "You've earned it, Grace. We salute you for what no one else could have done. What should your call sign be?" Her mind raced. Thoughts of Flight 282, the passengers' faces, the screaming engines, the sparks, the adrenaline, the fear, all of it came together in one word: Titan. The word escaped her lips almost instinctively: Titan. Falcon lead nodded slowly, approvingly, then turned slightly to his wingman. The two pilots executed another crisp salute, the kind reserved for legends, and spoke in unison. "Titan, you've earned your wings in the sky, respect and honor." The words echoed in Grace's mind. Titan. Not just a call sign, not just a label, but a symbol of her courage, her mastery over fear, her ability to wrest life from chaos. It was more than recognition. It was immortality, etched into the fabric of aviation history. The cabin crew, now regaining composure, approached, their eyes wide with awe. Passengers began to murmur, the whispers spreading like wildfire. "The woman, she saved us, the hero, Titan." Grace felt a surreal calm wash over her. The adrenaline still hummed in her veins, but beneath it was a quiet satisfaction. She had survived the impossible. She had guided 164 lives through a storm that would have broken anyone else. And now she was recognized, not for fame, not for accolades, but for having done what was unimaginable. The first officer and captain, still unconscious, were now being attended to by medical personnel. But the fact that they too would survive rested on her skill, her courage, and her relentless focus. She realized with a mixture of exhaustion and pride that she had done more than save passengers. She had saved colleagues, strangers, and herself in ways that words could never fully capture. As the media helicopters began to circle the tarmac, capturing the unfolding scene, Grace remained in the cockpit for a moment longer. She allowed herself to breathe, to let the reality settle. Titan, a call sign that would echo through aviation circles, military bases, and perhaps history itself. Falcon Lead approached one final time, extending a hand through the open cockpit window. Grace took it, feeling the weight of their shared experience, the bond forged in impossible skis. "Never forget this, Titan," he said softly. "You proved what courage really looks like. Today, the sky bowed to you." Grace nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The gravity of it all pressed down, but for the first time in hours she allowed herself a full exhale, a surrender to the relief, the recognition, the awe. She had become a legend, not because she sought it, but because she earned it at 30,000 feet. 164 lives, countless hearts, the weight of a plane, the threat of mechanical failure, and the chaos of the sky. She had conquered it all. The pilots saluted her again, crisp and formal, before climbing back into their jets. Falcon Lead gave one final nod, engines roaring to life, lifting him and his wingman into the sky. Grace watched them go, feeling a strange mixture of awe, gratitude, and humility. The passengers began to disembark slowly, each offering her a nod, a smile, a whispered word of thanks. Words were inadequate, but each one reinforced the reality. She had truly done the impossible. Grace finally stepped out of the cockpit herself. The tarmac stretched out before her, a battlefield turned sanctuary. The sun peeked through the clouds, catching the edges of the plane in a golden glow, as though the sky itself were honoring her triumph. And somewhere in the distance, the world would soon know. Grace Leland, call sign Titan, had saved 164 lives at 30,000 feet and earned a place among the legends of the sky. The applause wasn't loud. It wasn't orchestrated. But as Grace Leland stepped onto the tarmac, the collective breath of everyone around her seemed to pause. The passengers, the cabin crew, the emergency teams, and the handful of F-35 pilots who had witnessed her feat stared in awe. She could feel their eyes on her, heavy with gratitude, disbelief, and the quiet reverence that comes when ordinary humanity confronts the extraordinary. For a moment Grace closed her eyes. The roar of engines, the shriek of metal under stress, the terrified cries in the cabin, all of it seemed to collapse into silence. Every heartbeat of those 164 souls she had saved reverberated in her chest. Her muscles ached, her hands still trembled from the strain, yet beneath it all was a profound sense of calm. She had faced the impossible and emerged victorious. "Titan," Falcon Lead's voice called from the edge of the tarmac, sharp, commanding, yet carrying the faintest hint of pride. Grace turned toward him. The F-35 pilots had remained at a distance, wings angled, eyes calculating, disciplined as ever, but something had shifted. Respect radiated from them, tangible and undeniable. "You did it," he said simply. "Every one of them owes their lives to you. You made history today." Grace swallowed hard, the words barely registering. History. The idea felt surreal. She had never flown for recognition. She hadn't trained for fame. She had simply acted instinctively, courageously. And now the world would bear witness. The media swarmed cautiously, helicopters buzzing overhead, cameras flashing, recording her every movement. Questions would come, headlines would scream, and social media would explode with the news of her heroism. But in this moment, all of that felt secondary. What mattered was the fragile pulse of life she had guided safely through the chaos of the skis. She looked at the passengers beginning to disembark. Faces pale but alive, tears streaked, hands clutched to loved ones. Children ran to embrace parents, some still clutching toys forgotten in the panic, their innocence preserved by the courage of one woman. Mothers whispered gratitude so quietly that it might have gone unheard by anyone else, yet Grace heard every syllable. Each one was a lifeline, a reminder of why she had fought so fiercely at 30,000 feet. Her eyes caught a young girl, the same one clutching a stuffed animal during the turbulence, looking up at her with wide, innocent eyes. The girl's mother knelt beside her, and together they mouthed the words, "Thank you." Grace nodded, her own eyes brimming with tears she refused to shed publicly. "Titan," a voice said behind her. It was the elderly man from the cabin, the one who had been muttering prayers the entire flight. He reached out, shaking slightly, hand extended. You saved us all. You are a miracle." Grace took his hand, feeling the weight of gratitude pressed into her palm. She smiled softly, shaking her head. "I was just doing what I had to do," she said, though even she knew it was more than that. The F-35 pilots approached, walking with the precision and discipline of military men, yet their eyes betrayed admiration, awe, and respect. Falcon Lead stopped in front of her once more. He saluted, a crisp, formal gesture that carried with it centuries of aviation tradition, of lives lost and lives saved, of bravery and honor. Grace returned the salute instinctively, feeling a swell of pride, humility, and disbelief. Call signs in military aviation were reserved for legends, people who had not only survived impossible circumstances but had demonstrated courage, skill, and decisiveness that transcended ordinary limits. And now she bore one, Titan. "You've earned it," Falcon Lead said, eyes steady, voice low and sincere. "From this day forward you carry a legacy, not just in our books, not just on our flight logs, but in history. 164 lives. You saved them. That's immortality." The gravity of his words settled heavily on Grace. Immortality. Legacy. She had never sought recognition, yet here it was, undeniable, unavoidable. And yet she didn't feel the need to boast. She felt something far stronger, the quiet, overwhelming truth that she had made a difference, that she had turned sheer courage into action, that she had wrested life from chaos. The media cameras continued to hover, but Grace ignored them, focusing instead on the people she had saved. She walked among the passengers, shaking hands, offering words of reassurance, listening as they spoke of their relief and gratitude. Every story, every expression of thanks reinforced the truth she had come to understand at 30,000 feet. Courage was not about fame. It was about action, about choice, about rising when failure was certain and standing when fear threatened to overwhelm. A young boy, no older than 11, tugged at her sleeve. "Miss Titan, can I be brave like you someday?" he asked, wide-eyed, off-filled. Grace knelt, meeting his gaze. "You can," she said softly. "Bravery isn't about being fearless. It's about moving forward even when you are scared. Always remember that." The boy nodded solemnly, a spark of understanding lighting his eyes. She straightened, feeling a quiet resolve herself. Bravery, courage, action. That had been her mantra through the impossible flight, and now it would continue to guide her life, just as it had guided Flight 282 safely to the ground. The emergency crews began escorting passengers toward buses and ambulances. Some needed medical attention, others were simply shaken but intact. Grace lingered at the edge of the tarmac, watching as the crowd slowly dispersed. Every wave, every whispered thanks, every nod of gratitude etched itself into her memory. She felt the hum of energy that only comes after a fight for survival, a mix of relief, exhaustion, and awe. Falcon Lead approached once more. Titan, your story will travel far, he said quietly. People will hear it, remember it, talk about it. But what you did, what you accomplished, that is beyond words. You saved 164 lives today. That's the legacy of a hero. Grace nodded, letting the words sink in. She had never wanted fame. She had never sought recognition. But she understood now that legacy was not chosen. It was earned in moments where courage met necessity, where fear collided with action, and where one person could alter the course of countless lives. The sun broke fully through the clouds, casting golden light across the tarmac. It illuminated the plane, Flight 282, gleaming, battered but intact. It reflected in the eyes of passengers, in the sweat-streaked face of the woman who had guided it, in the polished helmets of the F-35 pilots. In that light, everything seemed to pause, suspended in a moment of awe and reverence. A helicopter's rotor whirred in the distance, ready to lift news of the miraculous flight into the skies for the world to witness. Social media would explode. Headlines would scream. But Grace didn't look for validation. She didn't need it. She had already known the truth. She had faced the impossible, survived, and saved lives that depended on her courage. And as she finally stepped fully onto the tarmac, leaving the cockpit behind, she realized something profound. Courage was not in the plane. Courage was not in the pilots beside her. Courage was in her. It had always been in her. And in that moment, the sky had witnessed it, the world would remember it, and the call sign Titan would echo through history. The F-35 pilots raised a final salute, crisp and perfect, a silent acknowledgement that she had earned her place among the legends of the sky. Grace returned it, her body trembling with exhaustion, her heart full and her mind quiet. For 30,000 feet and countless terrifying seconds, she had been the hand of fate, the anchor of calm and the master of survival. And now, on solid ground, she finally allowed herself to feel it all. Pride, relief, gratitude, and a quiet sense of immortality earned not by choice, but by necessity. Grace Leland, call sign Titan, had descended not just from the sky but into legend.